"Excuse me, this is my seat," the woman said coldly, her voice slicing through the hum of passengers settling into their first-class cabin. Malik looked up from his phone, startled by the accusation in her tone. He glanced at her boarding pass, then back at his own, which clearly displayed Seat 3A zone. "I'm sorry, but I believe this is my seat," Malik replied calmly, though irritation simmered beneath his composed exterior. His words seemed to bounce off her as she turned to the flight attendant hovering nearby. "This man is sitting in my seat," she insisted, her gaze never meeting Malik's. The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with an overly tight smile, approached them without hesitation. "Sir, could you please confirm your seat number?" she asked, her tone polite yet laced with doubt. Malik handed over his boarding pass, watching as her eyes skimmed it briefly before returning to him. Instead of resolving the issue, she turned to the woman and nodded sympathetically. "It seems there might be some confusion here," the flight attendant said, her focus squarely on Malik now. "Could we double-check your ticket?" Malik clenched, his jaw sensing what was unfolding, a story all too familiar to him. It wasn't about seating, it was about who belonged where. And apparently, according to her, he didn't belong here. The tension thickened as whispers rippled through the rows behind him. Some passengers leaned closer, intrigued by the spectacle. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to acknowledge the undertones of bias creeping into the air. Yet none intervened, not yet. As the flight attendant gestured for Malik to step aside, the weight of scrutiny settled heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one seat anymore. It was about being seen, or rather, not being seen for who he truly was. Malik retrieved his boarding pass once more, holding it out like evidence in a courtroom. "Here," he said firmly, his patience fraying. "This clearly states Seat 3A. There's no mistake." The flight attendant took it. Again, her fingers brushing against the paper, as if searching for something hidden within its folds. She squinted at it, then glanced between Malik and the other passenger, her expression unreadable. Finally she spoke, her voice dripping with condescension. "Are you certain you're in the correct section?" she asked, her tone implying otherwise. Malik blinked, incredulous. "Yes, I am," he replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Around them, murmurs grew louder, snippets of conversation floating through the cabin. Someone muttered, "Why doesn't he just move?" Another whispered, "He looks fine. Why make a fuss?" Each word felt like a jab, chipping away at his composure. Meanwhile, the flight attendant continued her charade, asking questions that bordered on absurdity. "Did you purchase this ticket yourself, or was it upgraded for you?" Her implication stung worse than any insult. It wasn't enough that he'd earned his place here. They needed proof beyond reason. As she snatched the boarding pass rudely and compared it to the woman's, Malik noticed how effortlessly she dismissed his presence while catering to the other passengers' every whim. Bystanders began filming discreetly, capturing fragments of the escalating confrontation. A young man held up his phone, zooming in, as the flight attendant leaned toward Malik, her body language dismissive. Others simply watched, their faces masks of indifference, or worse, judgment. Malik felt the heat rise in his chest, his frustration boiling over. Every glance, every whisper reinforced the ugly truth. This wasn't about clarity or protocol, it was about power and who deserved to wield it. Yet even as anger surged, Malik knew this moment would define more than just his day. It would echo far beyond this plane, exposing cracks in systems designed to exclude people like him. Before Malik could respond further, the flight attendant straightened up, her demeanor shifting abruptly. "I'll need to call security," she announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. The declaration hung in the air like a verdict, sealing Malik's fate before anyone had heard his side. His stomach sank as reality crashed down around him. Security. For what? For daring to occupy a space he'd rightfully paid for. The absurdity of it burned, igniting shame and anger in equal measure. Passengers stared openly now, their curiosity morphing into judgment. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, muttering under their breaths. One elderly passenger audibly sighed, always making trouble. Each comment pierced deeper, leaving Malik exposed and powerless. He could feel their eyes boring into him, scrutinizing his suit, his posture, his very existence. They weren't seeing a successful entrepreneur, they were seeing someone who shouldn't belong. As footsteps echoed down the aisle, signaling the arrival of uniformed officers, Malik's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about today, it was about every time he'd been made to feel small, insignificant, invisible. But giving in wasn't an option, not this time. When security arrived, Malik stood tall, refusing to let humiliation dictate his next move. "Listen," he began, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "This isn't about me. It's about every person who looks like me being told they don't belong." His words resonated, silencing the murmurs and freezing the room. In stunned stillness, for a fleeting moment he saw flickers of understanding or perhaps discomfort on the faces around him. But understanding wouldn't undo centuries of systemic bias. As the officers exchanged uncertain glances, Malik realized this fight wasn't ending here. If anything, it was only the beginning. Malik Johnson wasn't born into privilege, growing up in a neighborhood where opportunities were as scarce as rain in a drought. He learned early on that success wasn't handed, it was earned. His parents, both factory workers, sacrificed everything to ensure he had access to education. "Hard work builds character," his father would say, and Malik took those words to heart. Scholarships became his lifeline, opening doors that seemed impenetrable. He excelled academically, earning degrees from prestigious institutions while juggling part-time jobs to support himself. By the time he founded his AI startup, Malik had already overcome more obstacles than most people faced in a lifetime. Yet, despite his achievements, the world often refused to see him as anything other than a stereotype. At networking events, investors assumed he was there to serve coffee rather than pitch groundbreaking technology. Colleagues questioned his expertise, dismissing his ideas until someone else echoed them. Still, Malik pressed forward, driven by a vision of innovation and equity. This trip to Silicon Valley was supposed to be different. After months of preparation, he was set to present his company to potential backers who could catapult his business to global recognition. But now, seated or rather standing in first class, Malik wondered if any amount of success could shield him from the biases people projected onto him. Success hasn't come without scars. In Silicon Valley, a place heralded for its innovation, Malik found himself navigating a minefield of microaggressions. At tech conferences, he was often mistaken for IT support or security staff. Once during a panel discussion, an attendee asked if he'd stolen his suit from a thrift store because it didn't match their perception of what a black man should wear. Each incident chipped away at his confidence, even as he continued to break barriers. Investors praised his work but hesitated to commit, citing vague concerns about market readiness. Competitors dismissed his ideas as too ambitious, only to replicate them later under different branding. These experiences weren't isolated. They were patterns, echoes of a system designed to keep people like him on the margins. Before boarding the flight, Malik reflected on these moments, replaying them in his mind like a loop he couldn't escape. He thought about the elderly couple behind him earlier, whispering about how he didn't fit in. Their words stung, because they mirrored sentiments he'd heard countless times before, and yet here he was, a successful entrepreneur traveling first class, dressed impeccably, armed with a pitch that could revolutionize industries. Why then did so many still doubt his right to occupy spaces meant for achievers? As the confrontation with the flight attendant unfolded, these memories surfaced, fueling his frustration. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about proving his worth in a world that constantly demanded evidence of his humanity. The luxurious cabin around Malik stood in stark contrast to the prejudice he faced. Polished leather seats gleamed under soft lighting, and champagne flutes clinked delicately as attendants catered to passengers' every whim. Yet amid this opulence, Malik felt out of place, not because he didn't belong, but because others believed he didn't. He noticed the subtle cues, the way some passengers avoided eye contact, the dismissive glances when he adjusted his tie, the muttered comments about people like him. Each interaction reinforced the invisible barrier separating him from the rest. Still, Malik refused to let their assumptions define him. He reminded himself of why he was here, to secure funding for his startup, to create solutions that mattered, to prove that brilliance knew no color. But as the tension escalated, doubt crept in. Would anyone truly see him for who he was, or would they remain blind to his accomplishments? The answer, it seemed, lay in how this confrontation resolved, and whether justice would prevail over bias. From the moment Malik settled into his seat, something felt off. It wasn't just the woman claiming his spot, it was Sarah Bennett, the senior flight attendant, whose demeanor shifted noticeably when she approached him. "Sweetie, can I help you with anything?" she asked, her tone overly familiar, as if addressing a child rather than an adult passenger. Her smile was tight, almost forced, lacking the warmth she extended to others. Malik stiffened at the term "sweetie." He'd heard it before, in meetings where colleagues dismissed his contributions, in stores where clerks assumed he couldn't afford their products. It wasn't innocent. It was calculated, designed to diminish him. "No, thank you," he replied curtly, hoping to end the interaction quickly. But Sarah lingered, glancing pointedly at his boarding pass resting on the tray table. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she pressed, her voice carrying a note of skepticism. Malik sighed inwardly, recognizing the pattern. This wasn't about clarifying seating arrangements. It was about control, and Sarah wielded hers like a weapon, subtle but sharp enough to leave marks. As Sarah moved through the cabin, her behavior spoke volumes. To the white businessman seated across the aisle, she offered champagne with a genuine smile, asking warmly, "Would you care for a drink, sir?" For the elderly couple nearby, she provided extra blankets without hesitation, her tone polite and respectful. But when Malik requested water, her response was clipped. "Could you wait until we're airborne?" she said, barely meeting his gaze. When he nodded, she turned away abruptly, leaving him feeling invisible. The double standards gnawed at him. Why did others receive courteous attention while he faced scrutiny? Was it his skin color, his presence in a space reserved for privilege, or simply the unconscious bias woven into every interaction? Each microaggression added weight to his frustration. She checked his boarding pass 3 times within minutes, each inspection more invasive than the last. "Is there a problem?" he finally asked, his voice laced with irritation. "No, no problem," Sarah replied breezily, though her actions suggested otherwise. Passengers began noticing. Some exchanged knowing looks, silently acknowledging the disparity. Others ignored it altogether, choosing comfort over confrontation. Yet for Malik, these moments weren't trivial. They were reminders of how systemic racism operated, quietly eroding dignity one slight at a time. When Sarah made an announcement over the intercom, "Please ensure proper seating arrangements are respected," Malik's suspicions crystallized. The message wasn't aimed at everyone. It was directed squarely at him. He clenched his fists under the table, anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. This wasn't protocol. It was personal. Every word, every gesture reinforced the idea that he didn't belong here, regardless of his ticket or achievements. Around him, passengers reacted predictably. A few glanced sympathetically, perhaps recognizing the unfairness. Most remained silent, unwilling to challenge authority or acknowledge the underlying bias. One man even chuckled softly, leaning toward his companion to whisper, "Guess some people don't know their place." The comment struck Malik like a slap. His place? Hadn't he earned it through years of relentless effort? Didn't his success grant him the right to sit wherever he pleased? As Sarah returned yet again, her clipboard poised like a shield, Malik realized this wouldn't end quietly. She expected compliance, submission, but what if he refused? What if, instead of backing down, he pushed back? The thought ignited a spark within him. If they wanted a fight, he'd give them one. Not for himself alone, but for everyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Sarah seized the opportunity when the white woman insisted Malik was in her seat. Her voice rose, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the cabin like a blade. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify your ticket," she declared, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Malik's jaw tightened as he stood, his movements deliberate. He handed over his boarding pass once more, though it felt futile. Sarah examined it with exaggerated care, her fingers lingering unnecessarily on the edges. Then, without explanation, she turned to the other passenger and nodded sympathetically. "This is unacceptable," the woman chimed in, folding her arms across her chest. "I paid for this seat, and I expect to be treated accordingly." Her words carried an unspoken accusation that Malik didn't deserve the same courtesy. Passengers leaned closer, their curiosity morphing into judgment. Some filmed discreetly, capturing fragments of the escalating confrontation. Others whispered among themselves, their comments slicing deeper than any insult. One elderly man muttered audibly, "If he'd just cooperate, this wouldn't be an issue." Another passenger sneered, "He's making such a scene over nothing." Each remark reinforced the narrative Sarah was crafting, that Malik was the problem, not the system failing him. It wasn't enough to question his seat, it was about questioning his very presence. When Sarah announced she'd call security, the weight of public humiliation crashed down on Malik. This wasn't just about resolving a seating dispute. It was about proving his humanity in a world determined to deny it. The silence of bystanders spoke louder than any words could. As Sarah gestured for Malik to move, passengers reacted, or rather, failed to react, in ways that revealed their biases. Some recorded the incident, framing it as entertainment rather than injustice. A young woman held up her phone, zooming in, as if Malik were an exhibit at a zoo. Others whispered disapprovingly, shaking their heads as if blaming him for causing trouble. "Why doesn't he just move?" one man grumbled under his breath. His companion shrugged. "It's easier to avoid drama." Even those who seemed sympathetic hesitated to intervene. An older couple exchanged uneasy glances, but said nothing, unwilling to risk discomfort. Their complicity stung worse than outright hostility, because it normalized the behavior unfolding before them. Then there were the comments, casual yet cutting, that exposed the pervasive nature of racism. One passenger muttered, "This wouldn't happen if he dressed more appropriately." Another added, "People like him always make things difficult." Each remark pierced deeper, leaving Malik feeling exposed and betrayed. These weren't isolated opinions, they were reflections of societal attitudes that had shaped Sarah's actions and justified them in the eyes of many. As security approached, Malik noticed how quickly passengers shifted focus, pretending not to see the injustice playing out mere feet away. Their silence wasn't neutral. It was damning, reinforcing the idea that speaking out came with risks they weren't willing to take. Forced to leave his seat and relocate to coach, Malik sank into the cramped chair, his mind reeling. The physical act of moving was minor compared to the emotional toll of being publicly humiliated. He stared straight ahead, avoiding the pitying glances of fellow passengers, each look a reminder of what had transpired. Tears welled up in his eyes, blurring the world around him. For years, he'd fought tirelessly to rise above stereotypes, to carve out a space where his achievements spoke louder than assumptions about his identity. Yet here he was, reduced to someone who didn't belong, not by law or logic, but by prejudice cloaked as protocol. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. Pulling it out, he typed a message to his assistant. "Cancel the pitch meeting." The words felt heavy, final. How could he walk into a boardroom now, confident and poised after being stripped of dignity in front of strangers? The irony wasn't lost on him. This flight was supposed to mark a new chapter, a chance to secure funding and expand his startup's reach. Instead, it became a stark reminder of the barriers he still faced, no matter how high he climbed. Yet, even in his despair, Malik couldn't shake the thought that this moment mattered, not just for him, but for everyone watching. If people saw what happened and did nothing, the cycle would continue. But if they spoke up, shared their outrage, demanded accountability, maybe, just maybe, change was possible. By the time Malik landed, the story had already taken flight, literally and figuratively. One passenger's video of the incident spread like wildfire across social media platforms, sparking outrage and amplifying calls for justice. Hashtags like #Justice for Malik and Airline racism began trending worldwide, drawing attention from celebrities, influencers, and activists. This isn't just about one man, it's about a system that allows racism to thrive unchecked, tweeted a prominent civil rights advocate. The footage captured every painful detail. Sarah's dismissive tone, the judgmental whispers of passengers, Malik's quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. For millions watching, it was impossible to ignore the blatant bias on display. Comments poured in by the thousands. Some shared their own stories of discrimination at airports, hotels, and workplaces. Others demanded accountability, tagging the airline and calling for immediate action. "How many more Maliks will we tolerate?" read one viral post. As the backlash mounted, news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a pivotal moment in the fight against systemic racism. Journalists dissected the incident, highlighting how seemingly minor acts of prejudice could escalate into public spectacles of injustice. For Malik, the virality felt surreal. He hadn't sought this spotlight, but now that it was here, he realized its potential. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It belonged to anyone who'd ever been told they didn't belong. Amid the chaos, Malik received an unexpected message from someone named Elena, a fellow passenger who'd recorded crucial footage during the confrontation. "I know what happened wasn't right," she wrote. "I have video evidence proving Sarah targeted you specifically. Let me help." Elena turned out to be a young journalist with a sharp eye for detail and a passion for exposing injustice. She explained that her recording not only showed Sarah's discriminatory behavior, but also captured the reactions of other passengers, revealing their complicity. Together, they compiled a comprehensive dossier. Elena's footage, screenshots of racist comments made online, witness testimonies from passengers who'd spoken up, and even internal emails leaked by whistleblowers within the airline. Working alongside Elena reignited something in Malik, a sense of purpose. "This isn't just about punishing one person," he told her late one night as they reviewed materials. "It's about dismantling the systems that let things like this happen over and over again." Elena nodded, her expression resolute, "and showing people that speaking up matters, that silence isn't neutral, it's harmful." Their collaboration became a beacon of hope, transforming personal pain into collective progress. With each piece of evidence they gathered, Malik felt a shift, not just in the narrative surrounding him, but in his own belief that change was possible. The airline scrambled to respond, issuing vague apologies while secretly planning to scapegoat Sarah. But Malik knew better. Accountability wouldn't come easily, but with Elena's support, he was ready to fight. As the scandal intensified, Sarah's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Reporters hounded her at home, shoving microphones into her face and demanding answers. Social media users identified her by name, flooding her profiles with criticism and threats. Behind closed doors, panic set in. The airline's executives convened emergency meetings, desperate to contain the PR disaster spiraling out of control. Stock prices plummeted as investors expressed concerns about the brand's tarnished reputation. "We need to distance ourselves from this," one executive insisted during a tense boardroom discussion. "Sarah acted alone. This isn't reflective of our values." Meanwhile, Sarah herself faced mounting pressure. Her colleagues avoided her, fearing association with the controversy. Friends distanced themselves, leaving her isolated and vulnerable. For Malik, watching the fallout unfold brought a mix of emotions. Satisfaction, yes, but also sadness. Sarah wasn't the root cause of the problem. She was a symptom of a much larger issue. Still, seeing her lose control offered a glimmer of vindication after days of feeling powerless. Public support continued pouring in for Malik, bolstering his resolve. Messages of encouragement flooded his inbox, reminding him he wasn't alone. "Your courage inspires us all," wrote one fan. "Keep fighting, the world is watching." And so it was. As the tide turned in his favor, Malik realized this moment wasn't just about reclaiming his dignity. It was about rewriting the rules for everyone who came after him. The storm of public outrage finally broke when the airline issued a formal statement announcing Sarah's termination. "Her actions do not reflect our commitment to inclusivity," the press release read, though many dismissed it as a hollow attempt to salvage their image. For Sarah, the fallout was swift and devastating. Stripped of her position, she became a pariah in the industry, her name synonymous with racial bias. Yet, as Malik reflected on her downfall, he couldn't help but feel conflicted. Firing one person wouldn't dismantle the systemic racism embedded within corporate structures. It would only scratch the surface. Meanwhile, the airline faced mounting consequences. Lawsuits poured in from passengers who'd experienced similar discrimination, forcing executives to confront years of unchecked prejudice. Internal investigations uncovered patterns of discriminatory practices, from hiring biases to unequal treatment of minority employees. In response, the company launched sweeping reforms, mandatory anti-racism training, diversity initiatives, and transparent accountability measures. Critics argued these steps were too little, too late, but for Malik, they represented progress, however incremental. As news outlets dissected the scandal, commentators highlighted its broader implications. "This isn't just about an airline seat," said one analyst during a primetime interview. "It's about who gets to occupy spaces of privilege and who doesn't." For Malik, seeing tangible change unfold offered some measure of closure, but he knew this fight wasn't over. True justice required more than apologies or policy changes. It demanded a cultural shift that began with individual accountability. Empowered by the outpouring of support, Malik channeled his pain into purpose. He accepted invitations to speak at conferences, universities, and community forums, sharing his story with audiences hungry for authenticity. His breakthrough moment came when he delivered a TED Talk titled "Belonging in a World That Doesn't Always See You." Standing on stage under bright lights, Malik spoke candidly about his journey, the struggles, the microaggressions, the moments of doubt, and how each had shaped him into the man he was today. "When people look at me, they often see stereotypes. Instead of substance, he said, his voice steady yet impassioned. But I refuse to let their limitations define my potential. This isn't just my fight, it's ours. Because until everyone has a seat at the table, none of us truly belong. The audience erupted into applause, moved by his vulnerability and resilience. Clips of the talk went viral, further amplifying his message. Investors took notice, flooding his startup with offers of funding and partnerships. Malik seized the opportunity, using his newfound influence to champion diversity in tech. He partnered with organizations advocating for underrepresented entrepreneurs, ensuring others wouldn't face the same barriers he had. Yet even as accolades rolled in, awards, media appearances, speaking engagements, Malik remained grounded. Success wasn't about personal validation. It was about creating pathways for those who came after him. His journey served as proof that adversity could be transformed into advocacy, that pain could fuel progress. And though scars remained, they no longer defined him. They propelled him forward. Malik's story ignited a ripple effect far beyond what he'd imagined. Inspired by his courage, other victims of discrimination stepped forward, sharing their experiences and demanding accountability from institutions that had failed them. In Silicon Valley, companies began re-evaluating their practices, implementing stricter anti-bias policies and diversifying leadership teams. Tech conferences featured panels on equity and inclusion, signaling a shift toward greater awareness. Social media played a pivotal role, amplifying voices that had long been silenced. Campaigns like Daesh Tech for All gained traction, urging industries to prioritize representation and accessibility. Activists credited Malik's ordeal with sparking a movement, one that refused to accept the status quo. Even airlines took note, revising protocols to prevent similar incidents. Training programs emphasized empathy and fairness, while passenger feedback mechanisms ensured complaints were addressed promptly. For Malik, witnessing this collective awakening reinforced his belief in the power of storytelling. Change starts with conversation, he often said, and every voice matters. Though challenges remained, the tide was turning. People were listening, not just to Malik, but to countless others whose stories mirrored his own. Together, they formed a chorus of resilience, challenging systems designed to exclude them. Months later, Malik boarded another flight, this time greeted warmly by a diverse crew. Their smiles felt genuine, their respect unforced, a small yet significant sign of progress. As he settled into his seat, Malik allowed himself a moment of reflection. The journey toward equality was far from over, but strides were being made. Each step forward mattered, no matter how small. He glanced out the window, watching clouds drift past. Somewhere in the distance, a new chapter awaited, not just for him, but for everyone fighting to belong. This isn't the end, Malik thought, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. It's only the beginning. Malik's story isn't just his, it's ours. It's a reminder that racism persists not because of one person's actions, but because of the silence and complicity of many. So now, it's your turn to speak up. What would you have done in Malik's shoes? Would you have stayed silent or would you have fought back? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about what belonging truly means and how we can create spaces where everyone feels seen and valued. Every voice counts. Whether you've experienced similar injustices or witnessed them firsthand, your perspective matters. Together, we can challenge biases, break down barriers, and build a world where stories like Malik's become relics of the past. If Malik's journey resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful narratives that challenge the status quo. Stories like this don't just entertain, they inspire action. By supporting content that tackles systemic racism and amplifies marginalized voices, you're helping spark real change. Together, We can keep these conversations alive, pushing for accountability and progress in every corner of society. So don't. Stop here. Share this video with friends, family, and anyone who needs to hear it. Let's turn awareness into action, one story at a time, because together we can rewrite the rules and ensure everyone has a seat at the table.